sorry. Um, Never mind. I think like it's just like it was. Yeah. Oh, we're live basically. Okay.
Okay.
Hi, Dipto. Welcome to Venture with Grace.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, to start the show, I would love to start off like maybe early stage of your career. You started your career in IBM and Thomson Reuters, and maybe we could start with, what were some core lessons that you've learned early on in your career that you kind of took later on that kind of like shape you into, being the C-level leader at Cloudera today?
Okay, I'll give you a little bit of color on Thomson Reuters, and also a little bit before that, at a startup that got to Thomson, and then from Thomson to IBM.
Mhm.
Three things that come on top of mind. Early days. I think you'll hear me say often is about the complexity of software. You'll hear me say often that keeping it simple is hard, and making it hard is really simple in software. So what I learned was those days was really the comfort level of dealing with very small groups, and dealing with very large pieces of code. Like, we had 500,000 lines of code we had to maintain amongst the three of us. Um, Among Mike and Sheehan and I, we maintained 500,000 lines of code for a small, tiny startup in and that was building some specialized extensions for IBM kernels. And then a couple of years later, I ended up at IBM and ended up working at a very large group. The dynamics were very different. From three of us, I had to work with a team of 1,700 software development engineers. And that was quite a change for me. It's like a little bit lost every day as to the number of common software components we had for a gigantic system with 1,700 developers working on it. What I learned from IBM was really the physics of having really being in a very small group, doing three people working on something, and how that complexity compounds to 1,700 people, and within first 3-4 years of working. Um, and then what that led to was really my other learning at Thomson Reuters, where my most memorable memory, I would say, is how intrapreneurship, not entrepreneurship, but intrapreneurship within large corporations allowed me to start groups within these large corporations that nobody else wanted to start those days.
Mhm.
And rather uninteresting group that I started 2-3 times within that large corporation of $8 billion was creating a push button database to be publishing on a website. And those days, Mosaic came out. Nobody really knew what the browser was, and everybody just knew that we had to build websites by hand. But we came up with a push button way of building a website. Um, Things that people didn't want to do, but then it became the big norm when the large company. What really mattered was whatever was this little skunkworks group was doing. My group was doing something rather interesting that others didn't really know what we were doing, but it sounded pretty cool, and it led to this little group of 12 becoming 20, becoming 90, then being spun out of the corporation altogether. But those are the most memorable memories of creating small, valuable components within large corporations.
Totally. I really like what you said about like entrepreneurship. I wonder, I'm just curious, like when you are doing, let's say like creating something else, like instead of like a really big organization, what would you say are like three things that you typically would go through your mental checklist to create versus, nowadays, like since you're like chief product officer of Cloudera. So like you guys, we just talked about like briefly about like you guys acquired another company earlier last year. How do you think about like what to acquire versus what to build internally?
I think it comes down to having a scout mindset,
Mhm.
to be always curious to know what we are capable of building fast and bring to market fast, versus what we are. not as ready to bring to market quickly, and then what's core you want to build, what's a little bit outside of your core you want to get to market faster. You look at inorganic means, and when you look at inorganic means of accelerating, there are multiple options, right? I can go buy something, I can license a software, or I could OEM on white label software. And acquiring is really a version of white labeling, depending on what the dynamics are in terms of price points and how attractive it is. How do you quickly bring in a talent? Because those are really what I look through. That what's our sweet spot, and
Mhm.
what's just outside of our sweet spot that is still relevant in this market from a product market fit standpoint, and also beyond a product market fit, product solution fit. Those are two different Venn diagrams I think about every day. That what's in our sweet spot, what can be in our sweet spot with a little bit of a stretch, and what is completely outfield. Um, those are the mindsets when you make a decision. It's almost like a set of convex and concave lenses you take your decisions through and say, does it meet my thesis of build, license, borrow, OEM, acquire, etc., etc.
Mm. I'm taking notes. How do you okay, so before we dive into all things Cloudera, I wanna, like, go back to the quick personal development segment, and then, we'll dive in soon. So, like, who is on your personal board of advisors, and how do you kind of, like, formulate the people that are around you that helps you?
Great great question, Grace. Um, I look at I look at my personal board of advisors, and I something I'd like to share with you is, how do I pick someone? How can I profit from somebody else's experience than mine through sound advice? And that sound advice, a lot of times, may not be what I want,
Mhm,
but it'll be good, solid, unadulterated advice. And I've tried to embrace diverse viewpoints when growing my career. As another thing I would like to share is a mentor or a coach. It doesn't have to be your friend. You have to seek out an SME, a subject matter expert. And then, like, one of my mentors, Joe Pistrito, he always gives me sound advice, and he's at a level where he can have any job he wants. I mean, he used to be a direct report to Larry Ellison. He was a direct report to Serby and to Google, helped start Google, build Google's SRE. But when I need sound advice, I pick up the phone and call him and leave him a question. And then a few hours later or a day later, he'll call me back. And the advice he will give me is often not popular, may not be something I
mhm,
like, but I
mhm,
truly value his feedback. Just giving you an example. So be open to, if you're going to pick a mentor, be open to criticism, be open to unpopular advice, but be open
mhm,
to sound advice. And another thing that comes to mind is opting for a 360 mentors, as in my mid-career, I started doing this. 360 means I try to get a couple of advisors for myself who are more senior than me. That comes naturally. Then I also try to seek out who are peers of mine. And then I also try to seek out who are more junior than me in terms of number of years they were working. Because, the tech stack has changed so much. I'll say that the tech stack has changed 300% since I started. And the key is to learn fast, to learn faster than someone else. That's the key to taking advice, acting on them.
mhm.
And that's really the value of having a personal board of advisors who will give you good advice. And you don't have to know them very well. You don't have to, really try to hang out with them. You have to just call them 2, 3 times a year when you really need solid advice.
Totally. How do you select, like, which piece of advice that you would listen from who?
How do I select who the advisor?
I mean, like, not the advisor, but, like, who to listen to when you're, like, doing a specific
Well,
thing.
that's why the SME reference I made is seek out an SME subject matter expert who's
Mhm,
in the area that you're looking for advice. Like, you know, if you're trying to make a financial decision, ask someone who has got a better background in it than you do.
Mhm.
If you are asking for, there was a startup we were building, and it was a little bit before its time. It was a video analytics engine where I had to go seek out a couple of people in the Hollywood, and ask them that, hey, what is important to you? And one of them told me that, hey, if you can build me a video editor that is less than 100,000 per seat, there's a market for that. So it's
Mhm.
like finding white spaces in the market. And we went and built it. We built the video editor. It was a server-based editor. You only needed a plain old PC, a laptop to edit. But we were editing all the metadata of a low-res video. We never had the money to go build a $100,000 Avid workstation. And then eventually that startup exited. But when you're building something that are a little bit more beyond leading edge, you need solid advisors to tell you if even there's a market. Otherwise, too many, too many, too many times we end up building a solution in search of a purpose. Then the answer, it's I often say that, hey, the answer is 42. What's your question? But I've built this widget. Now I'm looking for a way to solve that. Something that solves a problem out there.
Totally. Wow, I
Yeah.
love that. Finding white space and then also listening to subject experts.
Yeah.
Okay. So I wonder, so like what's one skill that you're constantly trying to get better at? It could be like, leadership skill or like like technical skill like coding or soft skill like sales.
So,
Today is I
yeah,
feel like yeah.
okay, okay. So coding is easier to answer. I'll tell you, coding and leadership skills must be learned and
Mhm,
refined and reiterated, because
mhm,
I don't know of anyone who's been to school when whatever programming
mhm,
language they learned is not what's they use right now,
mhm,
because it changes. But um, coding skills, leadership skills, you have to learn. And then the second point I'll tell you is having a scout mindset.
mhm,
Try to learn it all versus be know it all, because that doesn't scale.
mhm,
If you genuinely curious about how to continuously enhance your skills, whether it's sales, leadership, coding, debugging, designing, it's something that you really get very good at it. And I have a simple, yeah, I read a book by Malcolm, it's called Overachievers, and there's a
mhm,
chapter in there that talks about deliberate practice. The one liner of it says that if you do something for 10,000 hours,
mhm,
you become a master at it. And why is it 10,000 hours? Because in a year, we usually work 2,000 hours. 2,000 hours times 5 years. If you've done something for 5 years, you get pretty good at it.
mhm,
And then you have to go seek out another area, another area, another
mhm,
area. Um, but really, investing in yourself is like a long-term stock, right? You're your stock. And I didn't. It wasn't great planning, but I sent myself back to school, every 10 years. I've sent to get my EMBA, and then also the GMP, the general management program. And I didn't really need it, but I went through it. It was a year of not working and going back to school, with a family where my wife and my young son was just, they were the one who were put to, they were inconvenienced because I was sitting, back in a dorm, college. Um, but you have to invest in yourself, over and over again, whether you do it through e-learning or on campus or online courses. Um, you have to continuously enhance your skills. Otherwise, you can't stay current.
mm. Um, what would be your learning areas? Like, would it be just like, let's say, like every year you set a time that's just like learning about the newest technology, and then you spend, let's call it like, every day, like 9 to 10 a.m., you do like the leadership session. How do you kind of like implement the learning piece into the day-to-day life?
Well, first you got to make time for yourself. If you don't put it on your to-do list or put it
Mhm,
on your calendar, it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen
mhm,
because of a side effect, and you will always end up deprioritizing that over something else. Um, but some of the learnings that I had to really prioritize things like, there are a few technologies that became relevant when I joined Cloudera, like the MERN stack, meaning MongoDB, Express, React, Node.js. I had to quickly
Mhm.
figure out that, hey, what are those? The Vue.js and also the Iceberg. I had to do all that fairly quickly, even though we were using,
Mhm.
Vue, and Node.js has been around for a long time. But it's something that you have to get deep enough into. And then there are the open source. There's a whole bunch of open source technologies that are no longer open source because they got picked up. And there are some asset databases like Foundation DB and all. Nobody asks you to go learn those. You got to go figure that out. Like the next database, um, if you have to learn something quickly, you have to look at and learn the graph databases, and also look at the zero ETL type technologies that are going to be becoming mainstream later this year and the next year. Several companies will be announcing those. You got to pick some of those amorphous areas, because the ones you're doing on the job, you learn automatically. You don't have a choice. But the ones you're not doing on the job, you have to be intellectually curious to go figure out, do I know enough to make sense out of this? That's really on us, not on anyone else to task you to learn something.
Mm. I feel you. Also agree with you on like, invest in yourself, and if you don't put it on the calendar, it
Yeah,
will never happen.
yeah.
Um,
If
so
it matters, put it on your calendar, and whatever time of the day that is.
I feel you. Okay, so let's talk about like, your day-to-day role. What's a day in your life as a chief product officer of
Oh
Cloudera?
boy, that's a great question.
A day in your life.
That's a great question. So, day in my life at Cloudera, I have to zoom in and zoom out several times a day, at least 3 to 4 times a day. And that's pretty exhausting, because you go into meetings, you go into discussions, you have to zoom into the details, then
Mhm,
you have to quickly zoom out of it to see what outcomes are you shaping. Um, that's kind of like the first thing that comes to mind when you ask me
mhm,
what's the day in my life at Cloudera. At Cloudera, we offer a hybrid cloud platform that straddles three public clouds, and it also straddles two types of private clouds. Three public clouds would be AWS, Azure, and GCP, and then two types of private clouds will be sovereign cloud and on-prem virtualized infrastructure. That really allows our customers to use the cloud as a business model beyond
mhm,
just a compute model, or beyond just a cost instrument for capex, opex. That era has gone. I think that was about 10 years ago. In the last 10 years, cloud is less thought of as a opex capex savings cost instrument. It's thought of more as a business model.
mhm,
And what AI has done, AI has really leveled the playing field for cloud. It has democratized the cloud for the large and the smaller corporations, because it's forcing people to think what foundational models can be trained on prem. Once it's trained, when can it be put into production, and when can it be where it can be put into production. If you have a AWS cloud and you have a Google cloud, where do you put it, where do you run it, where do you deploy it? And those are decisions our customers are making. And what we are doing is we're giving customers options to run any one of the workloads anywhere, whether it's on a public cloud of their choice, or a public cloud of they make a decision to run someplace else, or running it in a hybrid form factor. And given all these race for different models, see, all the models are built on the internet. Internet has run out of data. I mean, you can index the internet in 2 to 3 days. Back when I started at a startup, it took us 7 days to index 100 years of a newspaper, every article, every image, every metadata. It took us 7 days using an Oracle database with highly scalable, tunable. It took 7 to 8 days. These days, it takes about 24 hours to index the internet. But all these models have been trained on the internet, and you run out of data. Now you're going to run and refine and fine tune the models. based on not publicly available data, but based on your community data or your corporate data, your proprietary data. So all the models from open source are gravitating towards some sort of community or even more proprietary areas where the models are being trained on using some of the retrieval augmentation and other techniques. They're being trained in a way that we are using proprietary data. But where is that proprietary data being, coming from? At Cloudera, we have about 25 exabytes of data under management. 25 exabytes is, even a petabyte is daunting. A terabyte is, and we have 25 exabytes. So we see in the road ahead models being trained on enterprise data with trusted AI, and that's what really Cloudera is providing to its customers. So right now, it's an exciting time because Cloudera's customers are enthusiastically taking advantage of all the unexpected cost incurred on public cloud, training all these foundational models, the RAG and the agentic AI, and before running them in production. And that's where the flywheel is beginning to move, and we're super excited about what Cloudera is doing for these customers.
Totally. Maybe we could dive a little bit into, so maybe since like we at the beginning we talked about the acquisition and then what to build or what not to build. On a high level, maybe if you could give the audience a little bit overview on like, obviously we talk about like, the AI model and then the open source community. Maybe we could talk about generally like, in the AI space, what are something that you find exciting that you feel like defines Cloudera's like future? And then what are some things that you feel like are not necessarily gonna be applicable for Cloudera?
Things you want me to go deeper into AI? I can tell you, it's the A in the let me try this. The A in the AI changes this year to
Mhm.
augmented or agentic intelligence,
Mhm.
and each year brings a new hype. I
Mhm.
think each hype in technology takes a year to precipitate,
Mhm.
then a year to democratize, to deliver value to the customer. So, like the circle of life, technology trends go in cycles. While in 2025, agentic AI will be on everyone's pitch deck, I think few will remember that agents and agent-based software architectures were a bad thing 15 years ago. In 15 years ago, the largest corporations on the planet were trying to get rid of agents running on their networks. But this year, we're going to take them right back and then run it because that's the cycle of the decade has gone by. Decade
Mhm.
and a half has gone by. Look, I'm not going to talk about Gen AI because you have ample podcast going on Gen AI. It's the in thing. Let me talk about AGI, which is advanced general intelligence. The general intelligence is the North Star for super intelligence. It's in a nascent stage right now. And, if you listen to the OpenAI, you're tracking listening to OpenAI just version, AGI will be whatever makes them 1 billion in profit.
Mm.
So is that a clear definition, or is that a pretty vague definition, or is that a pretty smart definition? Because
I just wanna
there's
say only 1 billion. I mean, I thought OpenAI is supposed to, I don't know, like, make a lot more.
not just 1 billion, it's 1 billion in profit.
Right, like,
So
okay, so maybe for the audience who are not familiar, like, maybe we could start with, like, the differentiation between, like, AGI and
yeah,
AI, so we could,
yeah,
like, move forward with that.
I'll differentiate it. I just didn't want to over index on that because AI has been around for a long time.
Mhm,
It's been around. Its adoption curve has spiked since 2012. At least for me, I got into using AI on the job in 2013. Middle of 2013. It was April of 2013 when I started using, you know, like the random forest and the algorithms to actually run the threat intelligence on actually running AI algorithms on the job. So it's about 10 years, 11 years. AI is going to pick up, is going to become a foundational force. AI is already mainstream. It's not like we are experimenting with it. In fact, at Cloudera, our largest customers are running these in production, and we are learning from them, from their use cases of how they're taking advantage of it. Now, AGI is the superset. There's machine learning, there's AI, then there's AGI, which is the general intelligence. We should think of that as the superset, and it's in making. So it's in its nascent stage. At Amazon, I was part of the AGI organization in the second half of my Amazon tenure, and what we were building is we were building, you know, essentially a crawler that indexed the whole indexed built up models using scraping and crawling from the internet. So it was a major undertaking. We were also taking data, not just internet data, but we were also taking data from data providers, as in licensed data providers in various countries, and those data were being pulled in. When COVID hit, we actually took advantage of all the data from COVID databases and helped build a product to really help you make your appointments by simply making a query or making an NLP based request that, hey, um, Alexa, find me a clinic nearby within 30 miles that can have an appointment done between 5 and 6 p.m. And those were some of the immediate applications. So AI is mainstream. AGI is still in its formative stages. And I think before we see AGI come to fruition, what we will see a lot of cash being spent on, investments being made on, will be things like responsible AI, areas of private AI. It's super important because trusted AI, private AI, these are the foundational pieces that will have to keep us honest. Otherwise, we will end up, AI getting over indexed on doing things that it was supposed to do, and it'll end up doing things it was not supposed to do. And if you look back at the history of technology, a lot of languages, a lot of instruments we created, it was created to do something else. Like Java programming languages, I don't know if you look back as far out, but when I downloaded the first JDK beta, um, it had documentation references to kitchen appliances. It was created to be an embedded kitchen appliance language. It ended up being everything else. It never got into our kitchen.
Hmm.
But
Um,
history has a way of, this whole technology metamorphosis takes time. It always takes longer than we want, and it doesn't always happen on time, but it happens for sure.
I wanna, like, double click on, like, you mentioned about, like, earlier you mentioned about, like, agentic AI was absolutely not useful back then, and, like, maybe we could give the audience a little bit, like, a quick rundown on, like, the core milestones of AI, and then since you mentioned, like, obviously AI and AGI has been there for a long time, NLP.
Think think
Yeah.
of think of think of AI on the left moving towards AGI on the right on a time
Mhm,
continuum,
mhm,
with elements of interim features, maturity drops happening in
mhm,
terms of private AI, responsible AI, trusted AI, agentic AI. All these will over time ramp up to what's the North Star, the mental model of AGI. AGI is still a North Star, very much under scrutiny and under a petri dish. And this is where the open source becomes super important, because open source, you like it or not, is the petri dish of innovation. Everything happens there. Then some remain in open source, some get picked up, they become closed source, and some get restricted licensings. But that's really the anti-pattern that plays with innovation that is community driven.
mm. Um, like why do you feel like open source plays a big part in there? So since like I mean, obviously we just talk about like people are training model open.
Yeah, so open source, I say it plays a pivotal part because it's petri dish is what petri dish of innovation is. Everybody can look at the innovation happening right under our eyes. We
Mhm,
don't have to be, we don't have to have any exclusivity.
mhm,
So strong communities breed new ideas, and that is a force to becomes a force to reckon with. And these external forces often shake the open source bubble for profit. And then this year's news, if you look at news like Redis in March, and then Puppet
mhm,
in December, and then
mhm,
HashiCorp in I think it was August. But if you look at what was happening, a trend in the open source is moving towards a little more restrictive licensing, but users are impacted, and in the open source licensing changes, both from a pure turbulence, also tribulation standpoint, that why do I have to deal with all these changes. I'll ask you to watch a trend with WASM, or what's called WebAssembly, which is the next generation container technology. That's going to take us right back to, again, a cycle back 15 years, but it's the next thing that's going to try to disrupt all the Kubernetes out there, all the container based deployment models. So open source is kind of like that arena where it happens and all the eyes are on it.
mm. Um, I wonder, so like what's your prediction? You mentioned about like it's more restricted this year. And then how do you think about like it moving forward later on with like open source, and like how will that kind of like shape the next generation of like AI development into AGI?
I think you see, like the HashiCorp went from left to right, and then Redis and the Puppet went from open source to restrictive. HashiCorp went from more restrictive back to open, with that, with the whole Terraform and all that. Um, that trend is going to continue, because if you look at NiFi, it came out of it was open sourced by uh, NSA. If you look at, it was open source because they wanted a wider adoption, and then technology often for adoption purposes get open sourced, and then open source technology that is picking up, like the Foundation DB. Apple picked that up in 10 years ago, and they picked it up because it was doing some very, very key distributed database operations. They wanted it for their testing and QA and all of that. I mean, that's foundational. So very much there is it's a two-way door. Sometimes it open source gets to less restrictive, sometimes it gets to more restrictive. But you see this if you follow the trend of Redis and HashiCorp and Puppet and various technologies. It's something that it's got a season to it. And I can't tell you exactly what the seasonality is, but there are movements in both directions.
Mm, I think it's really interesting to hear just because, like, as you mentioned, like things comes in seasons.
Yeah,
It remind me of like the bundling and unbundling, and a lot of the technology and like business trends are about basically shifting from one end to the other.
yeah, yeah.
Um, Quickly saying hi to the audience. Hi, Muhammad. So, I want to talk about like, maybe we could talk about like, since you have been like, you mentioned about like Amazon early on. So, what was Amazon's like AI strategies when you were there? And, maybe you could just like give us some colors on like, what kind of project that you were working on towards AGI, and
Okay.
how is that shapes your thinking in today's world?
Sure. Um, See, maybe I should start with, I joined Amazon to learn how to build these flywheels in businesses that
Mhm,
can scale fast using focused teams at a very low price point. That was always intrigued by how Amazon is able to bring to market something as quickly as they do, just from a robot to a satellite to anything, right? Not just cloud computing. Anything the company is able to, and living there for 4 years, inside of the grinder, I witnessed it and I experienced it. And I joined Amazon at a fairly late stage of my career. But it's we built at Amazon, we built our team from 15 to 105 people using mechanisms like OP1 and OP2. That these are all fuzzy terms, mean nothing, but these are fairly crazy planning meetings without any PowerPoints, without any slides. But these are hard conversations. Only those who have lived through it can appreciate why it is crazy good, and recalibrate a business twice a year. No matter what business you're running, you will recalibrate twice a year. So the result was we would hit 140% of our target in 12 months, within 9 months. It was that effective. My AI learnings were three things I can think of. The importance of experimentation in an org when there are no requirements or PRDs.
Mm-hmm.
That was fun. Second one I would attribute it to is fast decision making using what we called two-way doors, reversible decisions. And the third one I will attribute it to really ruthless prioritization to achieve success in the marketplace. And we would do this by cannibalizing internal projects and doubling down on what matters for go-to-market and for the customer. So this is really, one of my highlights while at Amazon was to how to prepare for an interview with Jeff himself. That was for one of his companies, not Amazon, but while I was at Amazon. It was that's a topic for another day, but it was really that preparation was one of my highlights of my career, because these 4 years gave me a lot of these educations that, hey, how do you build these flywheels?
Mm. What kind of question did he ask you?
Sorry, what was it?
Oh, sorry. I mean,
Yeah.
what kind of question would Jeff Bezos ask you?
Yeah, these are it's all quantitative questions.
Mhm.
And really, looks like software architecture is not a software architecture. What does a software architect do is not really architecture, but it's put yourself in the shoes of a software architect. You're constantly negotiating what to connect what with. You're doing trade-offs and negotiation, and those things are not apparent to people who are building software. Just an example, just everything is a trade-off. Every API call is a trade-off. Every get or put is a trade-off. And that's what you to constantly make decisions, and every decision has ramifications, and ramifications are mostly quantitative ramifications.
Mm. Everything is a trade-off. Can you elaborate? So.
I can tell you just from the trade-off thing is just having gone through the C-level jobs a couple of times, like three things which stand out. One is like really think big but start small. Second one is balancing tactical impatience with strategic patience. That is super important. And if it sounds ambiguous, I'm happy to elaborate on it. But one has to temper tactical impatience with strategic patience in order to succeed in these tight spots. And the third one I would say is influencing and coaching more than trying to manage things. Those are some of the experiences worth sharing.
Mm. I think that the last one is like the hardest. Influencing
Yeah,
and coaching is more than trying to
yeah,
manage things, because I feel like a lot of like when people think about management, people think about like, someone just be there like telling you how to do the nitty
yeah,
gritty things.
yeah,
But
yeah,
how do you influence someone's decision? I think it's really hard. I think it have to come with like the person's like internal intrinsic drives, and then see if
yeah.
you can actually spot them, because I think for human beings it's always like kind of like complicated. Like you have 5 drives altogether, and then you have to really not just see people as like black and white. I think people's motivation is just like overly complicated.
Yeah, the reason it's you picked up on it. The reason it's hard is you have to create trust in the organization. I
Mhm,
mean, it's like a 3-4 step. You have to create trust in the organization. You have to be genuinely curious as a leader. You can't be doing this as a lip service, asking everybody, "Oh, what do you do today?" You have to actually live it, actualize
mhm,
it. Third one is you have to empower the organization to drive change with accountability.
mhm,
There's a book called Turn the Ship. I'll send you the link to it.
mhm,
It's worth a read. It's not an interesting read. It's not a use, but it's a very useful read, and it's got nothing to do with software. It has everything to do with a ship captain that literally showed people how to turn the ship in tight spots.
mhm,
Um, Next one is having a bias for action, where
mhm,
I learned the most about having a bias for action from Jim Collins' book, Good to Great,
mhm,
meaning never let perfect get in the way of good enough and get
mhm,
it out, ship it, and then iterate on it, not wait for this perfect thing to come together. Um, the next one is to really balance the confidence of the organization with the competence of the organization. And this confidence competence equation is a complex one, which probably takes more time to understand. But I
mhm.
have to balance the confidence competence equation, and then making it very explicit to the organization, and to push the organization through making, to really have a resounding impact beyond delivering results.
Mm. Um, okay, so I feel like that's some really great lessons. I'm definitely gonna try out like turn the ship. I agree with you. I feel like the Amazon 14 but now 16 principles is like leadership principles is like actually really useful, like bias for action and you know
These principles are useful, and they were not everyone is original. Like, half the principles have existed from Peter Drucker's days of many,
Mhm,
many years before. In fact, these principles are easy to remember. They
mhm,
memorialized it, but the company actually practices all those 16 principles. That's
mhm,
the hard part, is to practice it. You
mhm,
can have all these principles, right? You're supposed to get up early in the morning. You're supposed to work out. You're supposed to do this, supposed to do
mhm.
that. But it's planning and doing. There's a little bit of a difference. But if we can act on it, it really pays dividends.
How do you kind of like think about your own organization? So since I feel like being a PM at somewhere or like being a CTO somewhere is very different than being the chief product officer of your organization. So how do you kind of like think about implementing these principles into your team members' daily life?
Yeah, I'll say, as a CTO or a CEO, I've gone
Mhm,
through the CTO role 3 times. I've gone through a CEO role once. Um, Founders had to. So I'll tell you. Um, Let me repeat something about the think big but start small.
mhm,
First thing is knowing the customer experience
mhm,
versus the developer experience has gaps, and you have to just
mhm,
deal with it. Your engineering experience will be different than the customer experience. You're building products the way you want, or where you know how to. It's not how the software is getting consumed. That's point
mhm,
one. Point two is to have the conviction and recognize that there's a design versus specification does have gaps. Um, just like architecture versus implementation does have gaps. Show me any system, and I'll show you where its architecture deviates from its implementation. So
mhm,
that's like having that pragmatism, and you have to be a realist here. My favorite one is Stockdale's paradox, because the Stockdale paradox says that you have to be realistic. You can't always be an optimist or a pessimist. You have to be a realist. And then the next one goes to really balancing the tactical impatience. It's really secret to building world-class products. I Teams I've worked with often hear me say that, diagnose it with data and curate it with design. That really means you have to don't judge it, diagnose it, then curate it, and and you will get to the resulting state. And then if at a C level, you have to be outcome driven more than
Mhm.
results will happen easier if you're outcome driven. And the one that I want to add here, even if it not perfectly belong at a C level or not, is not, we shouldn't confuse business with busyness, because we get caught up in that often.
Hmm. I'm literally taking notes. I think that's really important. Don't just like you shouldn't confuse busyness with business. Um
Yeah.
okay, so you said something about like diagnose with data, curate with design. Um can you maybe walk us through what is something that you have diagnosed with data and then curate it with design?
So, so in terms of, there was, um, there were, it had to do with PRDs or data that, products are supposed to do certain things that, it, and you really start using the product and you see that it doesn't exactly do that. And then you have to go on a witch hunt of why does it not do, and then is the someone didn't build it, someone didn't write it down. And you will often sometimes find that the most non-functional requirement was never written, only the functional requirements were written down, and some of the most non-functional fungible requirements were never really. So you have to really think from the customer's
Mhm.
point of view, rather than construction point of view. And that's even more complex in software's case, because if you're in this structural construction, you can tell that you built the structure and certain pieces are missing. But in building a software, that's not very visible. So the most important thing in as and going from a CTO to a CPO role, you know, I'll tell you that you have to know your blind spots. I call that the unknowns. That if I know what are my blind spots, it just helps make better decisions. And I can give you it's not mine, but I've adopted it really, it works for me very well. Um, I feel like ambiguous requirements pose opportunities, and liabilities both, right? And we have to often work from ambiguous requirements. Like when COVID hit and we had to build, data lakes for COVID, and we had to deal with COVID aspects. Nobody gave us a playbook. Nobody gave us a requirements document to say, that's how you should ingest it. That's how you should, curate it. That's it. We did it because we did it in a very data driven way. Um, I'll give you the four step. You've heard this before, but there are facts. Those are known knowns are facts. And then there are the known unknowns that we call those the questions that we ask for requirements, refinement, et
Mhm.
cetera, et cetera. And then there are the unknown knowns. That's where your experience comes in. We call that intuition. And then there are the unknown unknowns, which is where we can explore the art of the possible. I mean, that's how it really works in building world-class products with ambiguous requirements, to anticipate what's going to be needed next before it comes to you on a tray that, hey, here are the requirements, go build it.
I love that. Quickly saying hi to the audience. Hi, Kazem. I wanna maybe shift the conversation a little bit into um the evolution of GPUs and data flow. So since you have wrote two amazing books, PowerPC and Power Physics System 6000. I'm sorry, the second one is hard to read. But okay, so basically you're a guru of the GPUs and we just briefly talk about the Nvidia news. Maybe why don't we start with, you know, the evolution of GPUs and then we can talk about Nvidia news.
So GPUs, now it's like a history, but here's what Grace, GPUs are special purpose CPUs. The fancy
Mhm,
term that electrical engineers call that ASICs, application specific ICs. Um, and GPUs exploit the floating point arithmetic. That's how
mhm,
it was initially for all the graphics cards.
mhm,
We would buy these graphics cards for all the video games. A graphics card would cost a lot. So that's where it all originated. Risk architecture in the 1990s influenced the acceleration of GPUs. You will hear about NPUs. Those are neural processing units coming later in a year or two. There'll be more coming. Now, NVIDIA's latest, that the RISC-V transformation, that one is the transformation for making open architecture central to AI today. In fact, I think NVIDIA is doing an announcement this week on the RISC-V transformation, RISC. That stands for Reduced Instruction Set Computing. I worked on designing the RISC chips GPU at IBM. Specifically, what I worked on back then was rather uninteresting, but in 20 years later is super interesting, because my specific piece that I had to work on a VLSI was the hexadecimal shifter of the floating point pipelines. How can you bump 4 zeros to the, in order to speed up the pipeline? And it's documented in my 2 books that I wrote back in the 1995, I think. But each book is about 400 pages of GPUs, but old is new again, and it's the circle of life of technologies, right? So it's RISC chipsets is going to drive future for GPUs and quantum computing for many more years to come. It is come back at an age where we are able to really exploit GPUs for what it was actually designed to do. But back when GPUs were constructed, it used to be an option. If you bought a PC, you would be given an option. Do you want a GPU or not? You would choose not to get it. But these days, it's become central. And another trend worth throwing in here is we are going to see hardware become open source, and software has already become open source.
Sorry, how does hardware become open source?
You will. Let's do another one on that. I'll give you another hour of open
I hope
source
you're going to
hardware.
CES, because
It will
I'm
be
excited
hard for
for
me to
it.
cover this in today's segment, but I'll give you why why the trend of hardware becoming open source is another wave coming, where hardware gets commoditized. Software has got commoditized. What remains as a special sauce is the data.
Wait, so you mean, like, okay, so on a high level, like, what is that? So, like, hardware is open source, because I feel like software, if that's open source, that's because it's basically means like people collaborate
Yeah.
openly on a platform, right? But like for hardware to be open source, like you can build a hardware together. But you mentioned about like the data part. So basically it's just the data component, or like the AI component, that's kind of open source. But the rest of it, it's like the hardware itself. It's like still you have to make it in your garage.
Right.
Basically. Okay. What about NPU? So you mentioned neural processing.
That's the next wave coming, because we are exploiting different types of VLSI, different types of technologies to accelerate this further, because you'll see more and more evolution of AGI resembling a human brain. I mean, until we get to that, essentially you're going to see NPUs as another set of contributory components to realize an artificially created a synthetic human brain, something that can make unstructured decisions, that can actually do intuitions, and it can actually do the thinking for you. Agentic AI will be a big wave, because a lot of hype, a lot of marketing around that. But I'll tell you, what we will see is, just like all of us carry a phone around, you're going to see everybody having their own personal AI assistant that does everything for you, everything you want done in a commoditized way, as in checking, minding your calendars and taking care of your travel schedule. And that personal, just like the personal communicator from the Star Trek became a cell phone, I do see everybody having their own personal assistant. You'll have a digital pet that will follow you around and do things that you want it to do.
By digital pet, do you actually mean like physically it will be like a digital pet? Because last year I remember when CS was happening. Oh, well, I'm going to CS next week, but like I think last year when we were talking about like CS, it's like the rabbit little like device, and then there's human AI pain, and then there's like a bunch of other stuff that's like focusing on like the
Mhm.
hardware component. Do you envision it's gonna be like, I'm sure you have seen the Boston Dynamic dog, and then there's like the
I have
communication.
seen, I'll tell you, I've seen the most sophisticated ones to be not hardware. I've seen those to be software.
Mhm,
Hardware has been a manifestation for it, but
mhm,
it's one of the form factors. But I've seen the most sophisticated ones. I've seen that does the full blown 3D imaging,
mhm,
and it will get a better pulse on you than those are all software. Those are mostly software brains.
mm. Um, what does it do?
It essentially it learns your habits, it
Mhm,
anticipates what you're going to ask for next, and it actually really becomes your assistant
mhm.
so essentially you have your own butler service doing everything you need done.
Is this like built by big tech, or like are you seeing startups that are building in this category?
No, these are R&Ds in big companies,
Mhm,
but that work is being done. It's not, people that we have to we have specialized success stories,
mhm,
and those
mhm,
success stories actually hit the press when they become more generalized.
mhm,
Otherwise, you have a very specific use case versus a general purpose which is much more powerful, which is kind of really why what happened to the GPUs, right? They were
mhm,
special purpose ASICs, but we also
mhm,
have 10,000 other types of ASICs. But
mhm,
because we were able to find a general purpose application for GPUs, um, it is now the mainstream. It's a specialized CPU at the end of the day, but we have found a generalized use case for it.
mm. Since a lot of our listeners are either founders or investors, like what are some areas that you personally find exciting? And I want to also highlight your expertise as you were founder yourself back then, as CTO and C-level CEO across multiple companies. As a prayer founder, as well as like I'm sure like there's company come to you for angel investments. What's some areas that you find exciting?
Think advice for founders, if I were to list three things, four things, those would be: first, start with the why
Mhm,
instead of the how. I highly recommend we watch the YouTube video. There's like a 10-minute on start with the why, because
mhm,
everybody in your company will know the what. A part of the folks will know the how, but very few will know why are we doing this? Why are we building this widget? So start with the why. That's
mhm,
my for the founders. Start with the why.
mhm,
My second thing to share with the founders, having been one, and I've gone through this roller coaster ride of it several times. Meaning, my second advice would be winning. Really, my mantra for the startups are relevance, reference, and revenue. There's a sequence to it. It only happens in those three sequence. Sometimes we get ahead of the other. We want revenue to happen before
mhm,
relevance, and we get caught up in that tug of war. Don't fight it. It's You have to be relevant. You have to build something that's relevant first.
mhm,
Then you have to get a couple of references that will brag about you. Then
mhm,
they'll give you five solid references, and then you have your revenue. In all my startups, the first three, four, five licenses, I give it away, 100%.
mhm,
$1, get the software license, and because the only thing I asked for in return was the next four calls that come, take those calls, give me a positive reference, and then the
mhm,
flywheel got created. That's the second advice. Third advice is the emotion of a founder about dilutions. Know that when we start a company, we started with 90% equity. By the time we dilute it to 10% when it exits, and it's okay. That's how it goes, because a lot of people fight that dilution equation. No need to fight it. Those are my three things for founders. And as far as board role with the Rank software and a few other board roles I've done, um, three things. A couple of things I can share is really fostering a vision beyond the immediate is important. You have to foster a vision beyond the immediate vision the founders have as a board member, because founders will have a hockey stick graph. It'll have exit at the far right of the hockey stick graph, but you have to foster a vision beyond the immediate. The second thing is a product market fit equation versus the product solution fit equation. The product market fit gets a lot of press. It's a popular topic, a very chatty topic, a lot of views on it, but the product solution fit is less chatty, but as important. Next one would be, you know, when I had to lead the compensation committee, it helped me learn a lot about establishing fairness in the organization so that the company, with the founders and the management team and everybody, they were set up for success with consistency. And that's really where the role of governance becomes super important in preparing a company for exit.
Mm. I love that. I literally wrote down so many things, especially the 3 R's, relevant, reference, and revenue. Um, okay, so I wanna be mindful of the time, but I wanna, like, maybe talk about, just, like, one more thing, and then before we move on to, a women fire round. So, what is your thought on the return to the office debate and its implication on productivity and company culture?
Yeah, return to office has gotten a lot of hashtags, a lot of press, hasn't it?
Mhm.
Um, I tell you, Grace, COVID era was an exception, not the
Mhm.
norm.
Mm.
Let's face it, right?
Mhm.
Return to office is a healthy practice and will occur naturally.
Mhm.
Having said that, our global teams will continue to work across time zones following the sun model, as I call it.
Mhm.
And that's how I built organizations over the last 30 years, and that's still going to be in place. The key to businesses is achieving productivity is
Mhm.
to really, with global teams and return to office, because people in one set office comes to office,
Mhm.
it's important, super important. And then one office communicates with another office, whether it's in a different city, in a different time zone, really doesn't matter. We run meetings with people in different time zones every day. There's
Mhm.
not a day that I've spent when I don't have meetings across different time zones. And that's the norm. And the key to businesses like ours is to achieve productivity, is by getting the pulse and the rhythm of the organization that is working across the globe as one entity. If one can get the rhythm of the organization right, then a lot of the return to office or working remote or working on a plane or working, all that becomes a detail.
Mm. Totally. Okay, so I'm also a fan of Return to the Office. I feel like a lot of the human productivity is
Mhm.
inspired by each other, and
Yeah.
I feel like it's always, um, nice to, like, actually have the face-to-face conversation. Um, why don't we, like, enter into the one fire round? So, what's your favorite book?
Sorry, what was that?
What's your favorite book?
You muted out one more time.
What's your favorite book?
Favorite book would be on the works on this work related will be Good to Great.
Mm. Who made the biggest impact in your career?
I'm getting a static on one more time.
Uh, who made the biggest impact in your career?
I would say the in making choices, um, as a mentor, it was Joe Pistrito. I've always admired two folks, Steve Jobs and Mother Teresa. And there's a school principal,
Mm.
Father Joe Saldana, who was our high school principal. He had a profound impact on me. He showed me that how fast can you learn a language, um,
Mhm.
and and learn it so well that you could pass a board exam when you didn't even know how to read or write that language. After that, learning a programming language or a business plan or it becomes trivial.
Wow.
So I have to say that he has been one of my role models who I look up to every time I'm trying to make a major decision.
What's a secret there? Like, how do you learn to pass a test without having a good number?
I think the secret is really having the grit that you're going to get it done.
Mhm,
Um, Grit is a prerequisite.
mhm,
Second thing is having this 80-20 rule of thumb. That how do I learn 20% of the language that'll matter 80% of the time, or I'll
mhm,
be asked those questions in the exam, most likely. Learning a lean language, I have to anticipate, hey, what kind of questions you get, and then I better learn how to read and write, and you know, you know, use that language in those areas. I think having that 80-20 rule of thumb is really key to doing a lot of things we do in our life. How do we quickly learn something we have no idea about, but suddenly we have to become reasonably knowledgeable about it in a very, very unreasonable amount of time, which also kind of ties to innovation, right? Because
mhm,
innovation, the best innovations happen when you're too crunched for time, you have too little money, too little time, and you have to do something profound.
mm. Um, how like who okay, so third question is who would you invite to your dinner party?
Who would I like to?
Invite to your dinner party?
Um, that's a good one. That's a good one. I would say Steve Jobs if I could.
That's a good answer. Where can we find you outside of work?
Where can you find me outside of work?
Yes.
Swimming pool
Swimming pool? That's so interesting.
or table tennis table.
Oh wow, table tennis table. I love those. Anyway, Dipto, thank you so much for coming to the show today. It was such a master class in leadership and AI.
Thanks for having me. Enjoyed it.
Let me quickly end stream.